Hello, my name is Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon. I'm the Executive Director of Churches for Middle East Peace. Today is Tuesday, March 5th, and today is the 151st day since October 7th. I give these daily updates to try to keep up with some of the major happenings in the news. It is the news that I'm getting this information comes from a variety of sources, international media outlets. I seek to get the information from a vast array of sources. Last night, I couldn't sleep, so I was reading from the State Department readouts. And I think this is quite important because it gives us an idea of what's being communicated from the United States government. And so a lot of the information from today comes from the press briefings that I was reading last night. A significant part of the conversation were questions about the hostage deal update. And we know that there's a deal on the table. This State Department spokesperson said that the deal would get hostages out. It would deliver a temporary ceasefire that would be 6 weeks, that would allow more aid to come in, and hopefully Hamas would accept the deal. We do know that Hamas has been consistent in saying that they would be unwilling to release any further hostages. It's believed there could be up to 100 hostages still alive in Gaza, unless there is a plan for Israel to leave Gaza, for the military to depart, but also for internally displaced people to be allowed, the 1.4 million, even more than that, to be allowed to return back to the north, and that there must be a permanent ceasefire agreement on the horizon. This issue was in the news today also. U.S. Secretary of State Blinken said that, quote, there was an opportunity for an immediate ceasefire, end quote, that would bring the hostages home, that would increase humanitarian aid in the Strip, and that would establish conditions for a permanent regional settlement. He also added that it was up to Hamas to decide if it was ready to participate in the ceasefire. So conversation is, that this iteration of what's being called the Paris, peace agreement, the temporary ceasefire is sitting with Hamas right now. A Qatari Prime Minister Al Thani said that his country, with the U.S. and other partners, is insisting that the hostage release and ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas must be implemented despite attempts to undermine efforts to bring peace. Ceasefire talks between Hamas and mediators in Cairo broke up on Tuesday. Reports are indicating there was no breakthrough. A senior Hamas official told Reuters that the organization presented its terms for a ceasefire and that they are waiting for Israel's response, which is interesting because many others are saying they're waiting for Hamas's response. Others are saying that reports that there are no breakthrough are false, according to an Egyptian news source. So we don't really know where things stand. We've been hearing this kind of every day for 2 weeks now. It was last week that we heard from President Biden. He had hoped that there would be a deal as early as Monday. Now, well, I guess it's only Tuesday, but we also had heard before Ramadan, which starts on the 10th, and then we'd heard, it wouldn't be until after the first week of Ramadan. One of the hostages who was kidnapped on October 7th at the Nova Music Festival in Raim, her name is Mia Regev. She was released in November. She spoke at a Women's Day event in the Knesset and said, "I know what it is to be a girl there, to be ready that at any moment they will come and kill my soul. It's scarier than death itself. And I'm here to say, let them go, let all of them go." And so at Churches for Middle East Peace, we're wholeheartedly supporting calls for hostages to be released in exchange for Palestinian prisoners who are held, many for political reasons, many on administrative detention with no charges having been brought, reports of mistreatment. So we're calling for hostages to be released and for Palestinian political prisoners also to be released. Continuing at the State Department readout, there was a question, why did the U.S. think it was appropriate to meet with Gantz? He's not the Prime Minister of Israel. The question wasn't finished in the readout, but Mr. Miller, the State Department spokesperson, said Gantz is a member of the War Cabinet, someone with whom the Secretary is engaged in many visits to Israel. He's had one-on-one phone calls on repeated occasions. So what ministers travel to the United States is, and how they make those decisions and how they coordinate, is ultimately an internal matter for the government of Israel to determine on their own right. For our part, we find him an important figure inside the Israeli government to engage with, and given the number of issues we have currently that we are in discussion with the government of Israel about, including the need to surge humanitarian assistance in and for our purposes, it's an important meeting to have. The question was pressed by the media, and the response was, we're meeting with Benny Gantz because he's one of the 3 members of the War Cabinet, one of 5, if you count the 2 advisory members, but one of the 3 members of the War Cabinet who has a critical vote and a critical stake in how this war is conducted. He's a critical voice in the delivery of humanitarian assistance. He's an important figure in the sitting government of Israel, and so that's why we engage him. It's important to understand, these are my words, The U.S. has a plan, and they're pressing hard on that plan. The plan is to revitalize the Palestinian Authority. Netanyahu has rejected that plan. He does not want the PA to be involved in the Gaza post-war, and it would seem that the U.S. is sending Netanyahu a strong message. If you don't work with us, we're going to work with other members of your government who will. And so, Gantz has been here meeting with our vice president. There were questions about whether or not Israel is on target. This is a separate issue to meet the deadline that was imposed by President Biden's national security memorandum. In large part, those answers, in my opinion, were skirted, but Miller did say in response to the question, is Israel on track to meet the deadline, referring to the president's national security memorandum. This is the memorandum that demands that all countries that receive U.S. weapons would use them in accordance with international humanitarian law, because Israel is at war and using weapons currently. They have less of a timeline. So by mid-March, they have to, fill out a form, have someone from the government say that they're using them in accordance with international humanitarian law. That has to be certified by Secretary Blinken by the end of March. And so Mr. Miller said, the deadline is clearly imposed. I don't want to speak before we get there. It's a matter right now. We're in discussion with Israel. And I should note, I know all the questions always come with respect to Israel, but it's a matter that's not unique to Israel. It applies to every country that receives security assistance from the U.S. So mid-March will be interesting. I described the process. If Israel is not in compliance, which most would argue there's no chance that they are, or many at least who are honest, the deadline that's been imposed, the U.S. Would be obligated, if it's going to apply this memorandum, to withhold the sale of further weapons. And there are legal applications that have to be applied. Yesterday, I mentioned that Israel was protesting the United Nations response to reports of sexual violence related to the October 7th attacks. The New York Times reported today that the United Nations says the inquiry finds evidence of sexual assault in Hamas-led attacks on Israel. They found evidence for claims of sexual violence against some of the hostages held in Gaza, but they said also that they were looking into allegations of sexual assault on Palestinian women that are being held in Israeli detention. They said they found clear and convincing information based on firsthand accounts. They also said that there were reasonable grounds to believe that such abuse was taking place related to hostages. Israel's foreign ministry said that they welcomed what it called the United Nations definitive recognition of these crimes, but they rejected the report's call to investigate Palestinian claims, saying that it was baseless and a deliberate Palestinian maneuver to create an intolerable equivalence. A little bit more about Gantz's visit with the vice president in the U.S. The U.S. government is looking for places to drive a wedge between Israelis in order to advance its plans with the help of Gantz. That was a quote from Smotrich that he gave yesterday in Jerusalem. In this way, Gantz is working to advance their plans to establish a Palestinian state. So Netanyahu made no secret of his opposition to Palestinian statehood and his opposition to President Biden's post-war vision. While Gantz and more centrist leaders are hardly boosters of Palestinian sovereignty and self-determination, it would seem that the U.S. administration believes they're more amenable to a post-war future that could be in alignment with what the White House hopes to see. So an incremental process through which a reformed Palestinian Authority could take on control of Gaza with considerable support from Arab neighbors or neighboring Arab states could work to improve ties with Israel that could be integrated into the region. We're talking about normalization agreements. The question of the normalization agreement between Israel and Saudi Arabia is still on the table. Just a few other tidbits of news. There was another humanitarian aid drop. I talked yesterday about how criticized those are by humanitarian agencies. Jordan said the drop was done in cooperation with France and Egypt. It was the largest yet to the Strip, and yet they don't come close to reaching the capacity of what ground transportation could do if it was safe to deliver aid. The IDF said it destroyed, one of the largest tunnels it has uncovered so far in Gaza in the north of the Strip. Secretary Blinken said that he has called on Israel to maximize every possible means and every possible method to increase aid to Gaza, calling the situation for civilians unacceptable and unsustainable. This was echoed by Vice President Harris in the meeting she had with War Cabinet Minister Gantz, according to the White House. And again, I would just say that, we have been consistent in saying the focus would not need to be on aid if there was a comprehensive ceasefire. The World Health Organization has said malnutrition in northern Gaza was particularly extreme, with 1 in 16 children under 2 years of age suffering from acute malnourishment. UNRWA chief Lazzarini said he has never been informed or received any evidence of Israel's claims that several hundred UNRWA employees were members of militant groups in the Gaza Strip. The death toll today is at 30,631 Palestinians killed, 72,043 wounded since the beginning of the war. Escalations and hostilities have continued between Lebanon and Israel. A home and commercial premise in North Israel was struck by rocket fire from Lebanon. IDF said it struck Hezbollah targets in several locations in South Lebanon last night. In Lebanon, 3 people were killed. In reports in Lebanon said 3 people were killed in an Israeli airstrike. So 3 Lebanese were killed in some of those hostilities. Israeli Defense Minister said that dynamic with Hezbollah is at a crucial juncture. War Cabinet Gantz, I talked about him being in Washington. So I gave that update ahead of meetings with security agencies in preparations for Ramadan. We've been talking about this a lot. Netanyahu has said we will do everything to maintain the freedom of worship at the Al-Aqsa compound. Speaking of what the Jewish community calls the Temple Mount. His far-right National Security Minister Ben-Gvir recently called for stringent limitations on Israeli Muslims and their access to Al-Aqsa. You may recall that Ben-Gvir's power and authority in that regard was recently limited. So it's a big deal that Netanyahu's talking about them maintaining the freedom of worship in that regard. In the West Bank, there was a stabbing attack where a soldier was wounded seriously, and a 16-year-old suspect from a Palestinian village was shot to death by Israeli forces. It came out today, you heard that Kamala Harris's speech on Sunday, U.S. Vice President calling for an immediate ceasefire. She gave a very, strident speech, and it came out today that she was harsher on Israel than the original draft called for. So U.S. President Biden in a tweet said that he was committed to pulling every stop to get more aid to Gaza and those who desperately need it. He said, we won't stand by, we won't let up. And I would just say, let's stop focusing on, the secondary issues, and let's demand a comprehensive ceasefire, and then immediate and adequate humanitarian assistance would be able to get into Gaza. Former U.S. President Donald Trump endorsed Israel's conduct in Gaza, telling Fox News, you've got to finish the problem. You've had a horrible invasion that took place, and it would not have happened if I was president. Syria intercepted a suspected Israel said that they intercepted a suspected aerial infiltration from Syria. And finally, the Houthis are still active and targeted a container vessel in the Gulf of Aden. So you can see that's my puppy Lulu. I have 2 Great Danes behind me. So a little update from today. We're continuing to actively work toward a ceasefire. Thank you for all who are engaging in Gaza ceasefire pilgrimages. Join us in our Wednesday prayer, our Thursday live briefings, and we'll continue to work together toward peace.